The Field Walker, Chapter 1. The Road That Narrows. The road did not change all at once. That was the first thing he noticed, later. At the time, it seemed ordinary enough. Stone worn smooth by repetition, dust settled into the seams, a horizon that held its distance without promise or threat. He walked roads like this before. Everyone had. Roads were honest in their intentions, even when they were unkind. He walked because stopping felt dishonest. The city had thinned behind him without ceremony. Walls gave way to markers. Markers gave way to nothing at all. Somewhere along the way, the air lost its echo. Sound no longer carried as it should have. It did not vanish. It simply chose not to linger. He adjusted his pace, not out of caution, out of habit. The road began to narrow, not visibly, not in any way that could be named with confidence, but was the sort of narrowing that felt first in the body, then argued with by the mind, like standing in a room that remembered too much. He considered turning back. He always did. But the road did not resist him, and according to his own code, that mattered. A man stood near the edge of the path, close enough to be noticed too late, and far enough away to be ignored without guilt. He was neither young nor old in any useful sense, dressed as though he had paused mid-decision and never resumed it. Most people don't notice, the man said without greeting. Noticed what? The field walker replied, slowing but not stopping. That they've already arrived somewhere else. The walker glanced back. The city was no longer visible, though he could not say precisely when it had vanished. He faced forward again. The horizon remained unchanged, closer, perhaps, but that could have been fatigue. Does it matter? He asked. The man smiled faintly. Only later. That too felt honest. The walker nodded once, in acknowledgement, not in agreement, and continued on. When he reached the place where the road gave way to something that was not quite a clearing, and not quite a boundary, he stopped. There was a door. It stood open, set into nothing that resembled a wall. No frame, no hinge, no threshold that could be named, merely an opening where the air seemed slightly more attentive, as though it listened before it answered. It did not beckon, it did not warn. It bore the unmistakable quality of having been open longer than expected. He did not cross at once. He regarded it as one regards weather, aware that observation grants neither mastery nor exemption. He felt no fear, no urgency, only the mild and persistent understanding that refusal too is a form of consent. Behind him, The road waited. Ahead of him, the door did not. He stepped through. Nothing happened. The ground answered as it had before. Dust shifted. Stone held. The air retained its quiet indifference. He half expected disappointment and found himself faintly irritated when it did not arrive. He waited. That more than crossing itself felt important. He turned, half expecting the door to have closed, but it had not. It remained open in the same uncommitted manner, neither welcoming nor withdrawing. He noted, without knowing why, that he could no longer say with certainty how far back the road extended. It had not shortened. It simply felt less available. He took a step away from the door. The world answered normally, too normally. Another step. The air carried weight now, not pressure, not resistance, something nearer to attention. The sensation of being regarded without a watcher. He had known this feeling elsewhere. In rooms where arguments had ended badly. In places where names had been spoken too often and meaning had thinned. He smiled despite himself. "So that is how you mean us to proceed," he said quietly, to no one in particular. The sound of his voice behaved oddly. It did not travel, it settled. He continued on. The road, which by all reasonable measure should have widened again, did not, nor did it narrow further. It refused resolution. Distance became unreliable. Not shorter, not longer, merely less useful. He suspected, without evidence, that this was the moment he would later misremember as the beginning. He walked for what felt like a proper amount of time. That was the trouble. The measure remained intact. Steps following, steps, breath answering breath. Yet something in the sequence felt rehearsed, as though the moment had occurred once already, and was now being recalled imperfectly. He dismissed the thought. Fatigue, he reasoned, was a generous inventor. Then a memory intruded that did not belong to him. It was slight, almost courteous, the image of a hand resting on a stone threshold, warmed by sun and worn smooth by passage of many lives. The heat lingered in his palm with unsettling clarity. He had never touched such a stone. The memory withdrew as it had come, leaving behind the faint unease of walking with certainty of speech. The memory withdrew as it had come, leaving behind the faint unease of waking with certainty of speech and no remembrance of words. He slowed. The road accepted this without remark. Time, too, appeared accommodating, passing without resistance, without markers, without demand. It was only later that he would recognize how long he had been walking without noticing the absence of change. When awareness returned, it did so gently, not as warning, as correction. He stopped. The silence had thickened, not louder, not more oppressive, but more complete, as though it had drawn a circle and closed it. The world felt finished in a way it had not before, not end, but committed. Some moments cry not out loud, for they are not events, but conditions set upon the soul. He looked back once more, expecting distance to explain itself. It did not. The place where the door ought to have been was neither empty nor occupied. It simply declined relevance. The road behind him existed in memory, but not an invitation. Understanding came then, not of the place, nor of its laws, but of himself within it. He had not entered something new. He had entered something that had long since allowed him. For there be thresholds crossed, not by boldness, but by assent, given ere the foot yet moves. The knowledge did not stir him to haste, nor did it offer relief. It settled, and in that settling he knew, without need of proof, that what lay ahead would not be undone by retreat, nor gentled by delay. What thou earnest knowingly asketh change, and what is change seeketh not its former shape. He exhaled once, slowly. Then he went on, not as one who wandered, but as one who had begun. Chapter 2, where he is not yet named. She felt him before he crossed, not as presence, as pressure, the way weather gathers long before it declares itself, the way a thought approaches from behind and waits for permission. The land stirs in small courtesies. Dust settles where it needs not have. Silence drew closer, not to listen, but to make room. She did not look at the door. She never did. Doors, once seen too clearly, grow impatient. Instead, she pressed her palm against the stone at her side, warm still, though the sun had long since moved on, and let the memory pass through her without fastening. That was the discipline, not refusal, restraint. He would come, they always did. She had learned the sound of that kind of arrival, the footfall that doubts itself only after landing, the breath that carries decision before understanding. Behind her, the world behaved as it should have. Ahead of her, it waited. She counted neither time nor steps. Counting invited conclusions, and conclusions were greedy things. They asked too much and returned too little. Instead, she listened for imbalance, for the slight hesitation that followed choice. It came, not sharply, not loudly, just enough. He stepped through the door without looking at it, which told her more than if he had stared. Those who stared wanted certainty. Those who crossed as he did wanted continuance. She allowed herself a small smile, unobserved. There are those who knock, and those who wait, and those who pass through what hath already opened. She turned then, finally, and saw him where the road still pretended to be a road. He had not yet realized what had been taken from him, nor what had been given. This was the dangerous mercy of first crossings. The world does not demand payment at once. She watched him walk, and as he did, the land adjusted, not in welcome, not in refusal, but in accommodation. The way memory shifts to make space for a truth it had delayed too long. Something in her chest answered. Not longing, recognition. She had known him before, not in this shape, not with this gait, but in essence, in reoccurrence. He carried the mark of those who crossed knowingly and mistook that knowledge for preparation. She wondered, briefly, whether he would forgive her later. She wondered, longer, whether she would ask. It would stay so. The door remained open behind him. It would stay so, for now. For that which openeth of its own accord shutteth not at the first passing, but waiteth to be understood. She did not follow. That was her rule. To follow was to bind, and to bind was to remain. And she had remained long enough to know the weight of it. Still, she stepped closer to the edge of where the road began to forget its purpose, and allowed herself to remember what it had cost her the first time. Memory stirred. The ground warmed. Somewhere ahead of him, silence was already learning his name. She turned away before it could learn hers. She knelt once the road had fully forgotten him, and brushed her fingers through the dust where his foot has passed. The ground held warmth longer than it should have. That is the trouble, she murmured, not unkindly, even now. She did not finish the thought. There were words she had learned not to complete. For some truths, once spoken entire, ask not for witness, but for remainder. She rose slower than before and turned away from the door. It would not close. It never did. the water that is not taken. The road did not lead where he expected it to. This was not unusual. Roads had long ago abandoned the obligation of explanation. Still, he found himself measuring the change, not in distance, but in behavior. The ground held his weight differently now, as though it remembered him from somewhere adjacent rather than behind. He walked on, the air cooled by degrees too small to trust. The kind of coolness that invited suspicion rather than relief. He adjusted his pace again, slower this time, and waited for thirst to announce itself properly. It did not. That was the first inconsistency. He had been walking long enough for the ache to have arrived. His body knew the ritual well. Dry mouth, shallow breath, and the small irritability that crept in ahead of need. Instead, there was only a faint awareness of thirst, distant and unurgent, as though postponed by agreement he had not signed. He frowned. The road curved, not outward, but inward again, so subtly it could only be noticed after the fact. He stopped, turned, traced the line of it with his eye. It appeared unchanged. Only the sense of it had shifted. This again, he murmured. There were precedents now. He disliked that. He resumed walking, telling himself carefully that fatigue was generous with invention. The mind, deprived of novelty, produced its own. He had known men who mistook this for revelation. He had learned not to. The ground ahead darkened slightly. At first, he assumed shadow. Then he noticed the absence of heat. Shade, but not cast by anything visible. The light behaved as though filtered through leaves that were not there. He slowed. The sounds of insects reached him briefly and stopped too cleanly, as if cut short rather than faded. He waited for it to resume. It did not. The road ahead appeared no different than it had 100 paces before. Stone, dust, the same muted horizon. And yet, something in the arrangement resisted dismissal. He looked to the side and saw, just for a moment, green. Not bright, not lush. Only the suggestion of it, a darker persistence against monotony of sand. He blinked once, deliberately. It was gone. Mirage, he said without conviction. He stepped forward anyway. The air shifted again, cooler now, unmistakably so. His throat eased, just enough to be noticed. He stopped, annoyed with himself for stopping, and considered the possibility that his body was lying to him in anticipation of relief. That too had precedent. He took another step, then another, The sense of green returned, not visually, but as memory, the faint recollection of water before water appeared, the kind of knowing that arrived before proof and often survived without it. He veered slightly off the road. Immediately, the road narrowed, not visibly, not enough to point to, enough to feel. He halted. The pattern assembled itself with reluctant clarity. The door, the silence, the narrowing, the easing of thirst. The world had begun to repeat its language. That troubled him more than any anomaly. Repetition implied intention. He turned his gaze away from where the green had been and realigned himself with the road. Whatever lay to the side was unclaimed, unpromised, and therefore suspect. He had not survived by following suggestion. The road widened again, only slightly, enough. He nodded once, to no one. That answers that, he said, and continued on. The air cooled further. This time he stopped without deciding to. The sensation was familiar now. Not hunger, not thirst, but attention. The feeling that one's presence had been properly registered. He did not feel watched. That would have been simpler. This was something else. The sense of being accounted for. He stood still and waited for the feeling to pass. It did not. Instead, memory intruded, uninvited and incorrect. He saw himself kneeling at the edge of water, fingers submerged, the surface unbroken by reflection. He could feel the temperature of it, cool but not cold, and the faint grit of stone beneath his nails. The image startled him into motion. He straightened, breathing once, sharply. The memory retreated at once, as though embarrassed to have arrived too early. He had never knelt there, yet the sensation lingered. That's enough, he said quietly, and turned his body back to the road. The road, which should have welcomed him, did not. It narrowed again, not abruptly, not cruelly, patently. He stopped. This time the recognition came first. Not awe, not fear, assessment. The pattern was complete now, undeniably in its restraint. The world had offered, withdrawn, repeated. It had allowed him to pass and corrected him when he strayed too far from what it had quietly prepared. That alone would not have been enough. He had ignored patterns before. Then the second thing arrived. Presence. Not sight, not sound. The air, which had felt attentive before, now felt correct, as though his position had been misaligned and he had just been set right. The sensation did not press upon him. It did not urge. It simply confirmed. He exhaled. "Well," he said mildly, "that settles it." He turned, not toward the road, but back toward where the green had been suggested, where the memory had intruded, where the air had cooled, without asking permission. He turned fully now, committed to the correction. The road did not assist him. What had taken little effort before now required attention. The ground held him a moment longer with each step, not in resistance, but in reconsideration. He was aware, dimly, that he had stepped astray, and that the world was allowing him the courtesy of returning without pretending it made no difference. The air cooled again, then warmed. Shade appeared where it had no source, and vanished before it could be claimed. The sense of green, once fleeting, now felt deliberately withheld. "You make a point," he said quietly. The path curved, then straightened, then curved again in a manner that refused memory. He could not have retraced his steps if asked. He doubted he was meant to. Time behaved poorly. Moments stretched without weight. Distance assembled itself incorrectly. He walked longer than he should have, or perhaps only believed he had. The difference no longer felt useful. He stopped once, uncertain why. He stood listening. Nothing answered. That too felt intentional. He continued on, slower now, each step placed rather than assumed. He did not look for the oasis. He did not imagine it. He let the thought of water pass without fastening to it. Only then did the air settle. The silence shifted, barely, and something in the arrangement of the world relaxed. He felt it before he saw it. Not water, not green. Allowance. He stepped forward. The road did not narrow. He stepped again. The memory returned, not intruding this time, but arriving correctly. Coolness at his fingers, stone beneath his hand, shade that did not insist upon itself. He exhaled once. "So," he said, very softly, "there you are." The oasis did not answer. It did not need to. He stood at its edge, still unseen, still unconfirmed, and waited, not for relief, but for permission he suspected would never be spoken. And somewhere ahead, still unseen, still unclaimed, water waited without insisting. The oasis did not reveal itself at once. That, more than anything, convinced him. He moved towards, not eager, not reluctant, but attentive at last. He suspected, without evidence, that this was the moment he would later misremember as the beginning. Chapter 4. The Place That Waits. The oasis did not reveal itself all at once. It allowed itself. He realized this not by sight, but by the way the world ceased in small corrections. The ground no longer hesitated beneath his steps. The air stopped adjusting itself around his breath. Distance, which had been unreliable for some time, settled into something that could once again be trusted. He did not hurry. That felt important. The water appeared first as absence, a gap in the heat, a pause in the dust, a refusal of the road to continue in quite the same way. Only after he had accepted this did the green resolve itself, muted and contained, as though it knew better than to declare victory over the desert. The pool was smaller than he imagined. This, too, reassured him. Its surface lay still, not mere smooth, but patient, holding the sky imperfectly, as if uninterested in accuracy. The surrounding trees offered shade without reach, careful not to overextend their promise. Nothing here seemed eager. He stood at the edge and waited for the familiar rush, relief, triumph, gratitude. None arrived. Instead, there was only recognition, not of the place, but of the manner in which received him, as though he had not found it at all, but had been allowed to finish approaching. He knelt, not because he was exhausted, but because standing felt imprecise, and rested his hand against the stone at the water's edge. It was cool, warmed faintly by sun, worn smooth by passage that had never bothered to count itself. The memory he had carried all this way settled into alignment. So he said quietly, unsure why he spoke at all, "This is where the road stops pretending." The oasis did not answer, but the silence here was different from the silence before. It did not listen, it remembered. He became aware then, not suddenly, not sharply, that he was no longer alone. Not watched, not approached, simply accompanied. He crouched near the edge of the pool and disturbed the surface with his fingers. The reflection broke too easily. That alone made him pause. "You're real enough," he said to the water, "to be inconvenient. So are most things worth stopping for." The voice did not come from behind him. It rose instead from the space the water held between sound and memory. He did not look up at once. Instead, he watched the reflection settle and saw within it a shape that had not been there a moment before. Not distorted by the ripples, not claimed by them either. The water had made room. Only then did he straighten and turn. She stood beneath the narrow shade, where the leaves barely moved, not watching him, regarding him, the way one regards weather, change already decided. I don't recall asking, he said. You didn't, she replied. You rarely do. That earned her a glance more careful than surprised. I was speaking to the water. It listens less than you think. He straightened fully, brushing dust from his hands. Then it's doing better than most. A corner of her mouth shifted, not quite a smile. You haven't drunk, she observed. It hasn't invited me. The air between them settled, not in tension, not in ease, but in a kind of mutual assessment that required neither to speak further. She regarded the pool once, then him. That rule will keep you alive, she said, here. A pause, and elsewhere. He considered this, then inclined his head. I've found rules that insist on themselves rarely last. She looked at him then, not as one studies a stranger, but as one confirms a detail already suspected. You crossed knowingly, she said. Yes, and you still came. I did. That, she said quietly, is the difference between what he wondered but did not ask. Instead, he glanced once more at the water. The surface had stilled again, as though it had never been disturbed. Does this place belong to anyone? He asked. No. Does it mind being used? Yes. That earned her another look, brief, appreciative. The silence returned, fuller now. When he looked up again, she had stopped just beyond the edge of the pool's reach, not away, aside, enough that the reflection reclaimed itself. Remember this place correctly, she said, not as instruction, not as warning. Then she was no longer there. The oasis remained. After a moment, he knelt and drank. The water was cool. Nothing else happened. For a time, he did not move. This was not hesitation. It was calibration. The place she had occupied did not immediately relinquish itself. Shade lingered where her shadow had never quite fallen. The air retained a shape it no longer needed. He had the peculiar sensation of having arrived just after a sentence had been spoken out loud and choosing not to ask for it to be repeated. He looked at the pool again. The surface held nothing now but sky, unevenly, indifferently. If she had ever been there, the water declined to remember it. That somehow unsettled him more than her disappearance. He crouched and drank. The water was cool as expected, clean, unremarkable in every way that could be tested. He drank slowly, stopping once to see if the relief would overtake him all at once. It did not. Instead, thirst receded as though it had never intended to assert itself fully. The sensation left behind was not satisfaction, but correction. The subtle sense of having been restored to a line he had strayed from without noticing. He rinsed his hands and let the excess water fall back into the pool. The surface accepted it without ripple or complaint. "So," he said quietly, uncertain why he spoke again, "that's how you are." The oasis did not answer, but something about the silence shifted. Not listening now, not remembering, but holding, as though the place had acknowledged the exchange and found no further comment necessary. He sat back on his heels and let the moment lengthen. It occurred to him, not unpleasantly, that he could remain here longer than intended, that the thought of leaving required more effort than the thought of staying. The road beyond the trees had not announced itself since his arrival. It waited without insistence. That, he realized, was the danger. He rose. The sense of alignment held, for now, but he knew better than to mistake permission for invitation. He adjusted his pack, checked the position of the sun out of habit more than need, and turned once more toward the pool. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw her again, not as reflection, not as presence, but as possibility. The idea of a figure standing just beyond the edge of comprehension, where memory had not yet decided what to keep. He blinked. There was only water. Later, much later, he would recall this meeting differently. He would remember her standing closer than she had. He would remember her watching him drink, though she had not. He would misremember the tone of her voice, lending it warmth or warning, depending on what followed in the days ahead. What he would not misremember was this: that she did not ask him to stay, that she had not told him to go, that she had regarded him not as one lost, nor as one chosen, but as one moving, and therefore unfinished. He stepped away from the oasis without ceremony. The road accepted him again, though not without a certain reluctance. Shade thinned. The air resumed its earlier habits. Distance returned to usefulness. Behind him, the water remained. It would remain, whether he remembered it or not. He did not look back. That, too, felt important.